In 1995, a cluster of medical reports from remote clinics in Alaska described patients with core body temperatures below 30 degrees Celsius who were still moving, still aggressive, and, according to at least 3 accounts, unresponsive to pain. What follows is not a story of the undead, but the life cycle of an event. The convergence of disease, environment, and human error that later became a rumor of a zombie outbreak, and how that rumor was born, grew, peaked, and was quietly buried. The problem began with isolation, vast distances, limited infrastructure, and winter conditions that could erase a road in hours shaped every medical and logistical decision across the Northern Territories. Small communities depended on irregular supply chains, light aircraft, and communication systems that were often delayed or degraded by weather. Lesser-known fact: supply constraint. In the mid-1990s, some rural Alaskan clinics operated with resupply intervals exceeding 10 to 14 days during winter storms, forcing rationing of antibiotics and sedatives. The parents of the event were not conspirators, but systems, public health limitations, environmental extremes, and a handful of overlapping biological phenomena. Reports later pointed toward severe cases of infection combined with hypothermia and possible toxin exposure, conditions that together can alter behavior dramatically. Neurological symptoms such as agitation, confusion, and reduced pain response are well documented under extreme stress and illness. Lesser-known fact: medical/psychological effect. Hypothermia can paradoxically produce agitation and violent resistance in its middle stages, a response sometimes called paradoxical undressing when combined with confusion. Early cases were not recognized as a pattern: a patient here, another there, each treated in isolation with incomplete data. Some showed signs consistent with infections like encephalitis. Others suggested metabolic collapse due to exposure. Without rapid diagnostics, clinicians relied on observation and experience. Lesser-known fact: test result. In the 1990s, confirmatory lab tests for viral encephalitis in remote settings often required transport to centralized facilities, adding delays of 48 to 72 hours or more. The first decisions were cautious but imperfect. Sedation was used to manage agitation. Restraints were applied when patients posed a risk to themselves or others. Evacuation was attempted when possible, but weather frequently intervened. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Small aircraft used for medical evacuation in Alaska often had strict weight limits, forcing crews to choose between additional equipment and additional personnel. Childhood in this life story was confusion. The event began to cohere into something larger only after multiple reports reached regional authorities. Patterns emerged: similar symptoms, similar environmental exposure, similar outcomes. Yet the interpretation varied widely. Some clinicians suspected toxins, others leaned toward infection, a few considered combined causes. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Rural health aides in Alaska often received broad emergency training but limited specialization, requiring them to manage neurological crises without on-site specialists. Early failures were not dramatic but cumulative. Miscommunication between facilities led to duplicated efforts and missed connections. A case that might have informed another arrived too late to change its outcome. Documentation was inconsistent, shaped by urgency and limited resources. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Standardized electronic medical records were not widely implemented in remote Alaskan clinics in 1995, resulting in reliance on paper logs vulnerable to delay and loss. Small changes began to matter. Isolation protocols were tightened, not because of confirmed contagion, but because of uncertainty. Protective equipment use increased. Sedation protocols were adjusted to account for unusual resistance. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. In uncertain outbreaks, even without confirmed transmission, precautionary isolation can reduce secondary complications by limiting exposure to environmental stressors and secondary infections. Growth came not in scale, but in coordination. Regional health authorities began to treat the scattered reports as a single incident. Communication improved, and patterns were tracked more deliberately. Supplies were redirected to affected areas. Transport was prioritized when weather allowed. Lesser-known fact, logistics detail. Coordination of medical flights in Alaska often depends on a network of volunteer and contracted pilots, with availability fluctuating based on weather and daylight. Standardization followed. Treatment approaches became more consistent. Aggressive warming for hypothermia, broad-spectrum antibiotics when infection was suspected, and careful monitoring of neurological status. Training updates were disseminated as quickly as possible. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. In public health responses in remote regions often shift from decentralized autonomy to centralized coordination during multi-case incidents, improving consistency but sometimes slowing local decision-making. The system around the event matured rapidly. Information flowed more reliably. Supplies were staged closer to affected areas. Personnel rotated in and out to prevent exhaustion. Lesser-known fact, weather/terrain impact. In winter conditions in Alaska, visibility can reduce to near zero for extended periods, grounding aircraft and isolating communities completely for days. Peak, in this case, was not a battle, but a moment of clarity. The highest concentration of cases occurred within a narrow window, drawing the full attention of regional authorities. Media awareness was minimal, limited by geography and the absence of immediate reporting channels. Within the affected communities, however, the event felt intense and immediate. Lesser-known fact, psychological effect. In isolated communities, perceived threat can escalate rapidly due to external information, amplifying fear even when case numbers are relatively low. A defining scenario unfolded in one of the larger affected settlements. Multiple patients presented within a short period, overwhelming local capacity. Evacuation was delayed by weather, forcing on-site management. Staff worked extended shifts, improvising with limited resources. Lesser-known fact, battlefield improvisation. In remote medicine, improvisation can include repurposing non-medical equipment for patient stabilization when standard tools are unavailable. Why did it work in the sense of resolution? Because the system adapted. Environmental exposure was mitigated through better shelter and heating. Suspected infections were treated early. Communication reduced duplication of errors. Over time, the cluster subsided. Lesser-known fact, test result. Many neurological symptoms associated with severe hypothermia and infection can resolve significantly with timely warming and supportive care, reducing long-term damage. The cost was human. Exhaustion among medical staff was severe. Emotional strain accumulated, particularly in small teams with little relief. Patients suffered not only from illness, but from the stress of restraint and isolation. Lesser-known fact, medical/psychological effect. Prolonged high-stress medical response environments are associated with increased rates of burnout and secondary trauma stress among healthcare workers. Fatigue altered judgment. Small errors became more likely. The line between caution and overreaction blurred under pressure. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Crisis training often emphasizes decision-making under stress, but real-world fatigue can degrade even well-practiced protocols. Injury patterns reflected the nature of the symptoms: self-inflicted harm during agitation, complications from prolonged exposure, and the underlying illnesses themselves. Mortality figures remain uncertain, estimates vary, and documentation was incomplete. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Inconsistent record-keeping during crisis events can complicate later analysis, leading to disputed statistics and gaps in understanding. Old age for the event came quickly. As conditions stabilized and no new clusters appeared, attention shifted elsewhere. The mechanisms behind the incident were studied, but without a single definitive cause, conclusions remained cautious. Improved infrastructure and communication reduced the likelihood of similar patterns going unnoticed. Lesser-known fact: countermeasure. Investment in telemedicine and satellite communication in remote regions.
In the winter of 1995, fewer than a dozen case files, some handwritten, some partially lost, described patients in remote parts of Alaska who could no longer be reasoned with, restrained only with difficulty, and in some cases required multiple adults to control. This is where the event learned to survive, not in biology alone, but in the system that tried to contain it, adapt to it, and understand it before it slipped away. Growth in this life did not mean expansion across a map, it meant density. More observations, more coordination, more pressure on a system not built for speed. Health authorities began connecting the reports, comparing symptoms, timelines, and environmental exposure. Lesser-known fact: command doctrines shift. When loosely connected incidents begin to share symptom profiles, public health doctrine often shifts from reactive treatment to pattern recognition and containment, even before a cause is confirmed. Standardization followed in uneven steps. Clinics were advised to treat agitation not as isolated behavioral issues, but as part of a broader syndrome. Protocols for sedation were refined, balancing safety with the risk of respiratory suppression in cold-stressed patients. Lesser-known fact: design compromise. Sedatives used in cold environments can have unpredictable effects due to slowed metabolism, forcing clinicians to adjust dosages with incomplete data. Logistics became the backbone of response. Supplies, warming blankets, IV fluids, antibiotics were moved closer to affected areas. Air transport schedules were reworked around weather windows measured in hours, not days. Lesser-known fact: supply constraint. In sub-zero conditions, standard IV fluids can freeze if not actively insulated, complicating even basic treatment during transport. The system matured through repetition. Each new case added detail, patterns sharpened, exposure to extreme cold, delayed treatment, neurological symptoms that escalated rapidly. Communication improved, not because technology advanced overnight, but because urgency forced discipline. Lesser-known fact: production issue. Radio communication logs from remote Alaskan regions in the 1990s were often manually recorded, introducing delays and transcription errors that affected coordination. Training adapted in real time. Health workers were briefed, sometimes over unreliable radio links, on what to expect and how to respond. Improvisation became part of protocol. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. In remote medical systems, on-the-job adaptation is often formalized after the fact, turning improvisation into future training doctrine. Peak arrived quietly. No sirens, no headlines, just a cluster of cases that exceeded the capacity of a single community to manage. Multiple patients, similar symptoms, arriving within a compressed time frame. The system, now primed, responded with everything it had. Lesser-known fact: countermeasure. Rapid clustering of cases often triggers preemptive isolation measures, even without confirmed contagion, reducing secondary complications and simplifying triage. A defining moment unfolded in a settlement accessible only by air for much of the year. Weather grounded evacuation flights. Medical staff faced a decision: wait and risk deterioration, or act with limited tools. They chose to act. Patients were stabilized with aggressive warming, hydration, and controlled sedation. Lesser-known fact: battlefield improvisation. In extreme conditions, warming techniques can include improvised insulation with non-medical materials when specialized equipment is unavailable. Why did the response work there? Because the variables aligned just enough. Shelter held, supplies lasted, communication, though strained, did not collapse, and crucially, the staff understood that the behavior they were seeing, violent, resistant, almost mechanical, was a symptom, not a threat in itself. Lesser-known fact: medical/psychological effect. Severe metabolic and neurological stress can suppress higher cognitive functions, leaving only reflexive or survival-driven behavior that appears detached from normal personality. At peak, the event was most misunderstood. Descriptions of patients spread informally, stripped of context, amplified by fear. Words like uncontrollable and inhuman traveled faster than clinical explanations. Lesser-known fact: psychological effect. In crisis communication, emotionally charged descriptors are more likely to be remembered and repeated than precise medical terminology. The cost accumulated beneath the surface. Medical staff worked beyond safe limits, often without relief. Sleep deprivation blurred judgment. Small mistakes carried larger consequences. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail. Studies of emergency responders show measurable declines in cognitive performance after 18 to 24 hours without sleep, comparable to mild intoxication. Patients paid a different price: prolonged exposure, delayed treatment, and the stress of restraint left lasting effects for some. Recovery, when it came, was uneven. Lesser-known fact: medical/psychological effect. Severe metabolic and neurological stress can suppress higher cognitive functions, leaving only reflexive or survival-driven behavior that appears detached from normal personality. Communities absorbed the shock collectively. In small populations, every case is personal. Fear spread not through numbers, but through proximity. Lesser-known fact: weather/terrain impact. Geographic isolation can intensify perceived risk, since limited evacuation options reduce the sense of control over a crisis. Old age for the event began as quickly as its peak. Cases declined, patterns dissolved. What had seemed like a growing threat receded into scattered incidents again. Without a clear, singular cause, the urgency faded. Lesser-known fact: test result. Many outbreak investigations conclude without definitive identification of a single causative agent, especially when multiple factors interact. Replacement came not as a new event, but as improved systems. Communication infrastructure expanded. Training incorporated lessons learned. Supplies were pre-positioned with greater foresight. Lesser-known fact: countermeasure. The expansion of satellite communication in remote regions significantly reduced response times for medical coordination after the 1990s. And the narrative, however, took a different path. Stripped of context, the behavior of those patients became something else in memory. Stories condensed, sharpened, and eventually transformed into the language of outbreaks and the imagery of the undead. Lesser-known fact: psychological effect. Memory reconstruction tends to favor coherent, dramatic narratives over fragmented, ambiguous reality. There was no coordinated cover-up in the conventional sense. What happened instead was quieter: fragmentation of information, lack of centralized reporting, and the natural decay of detail over time.
Without a single definitive account, speculation filled the gaps. Lesser-known fact, production issue. Archival records from decentralized systems often suffer from incomplete preservation, especially when events are not initially classified as major incidents. Legacy lives in systems, not stories. Rural healthcare improved. Emergency protocols became more flexible. The importance of early coordination and environmental awareness was reinforced. Lesser-known fact, design compromise. Modern emergency planning in remote regions often balances redundancy with cost, accepting some inefficiency to ensure resilience. Later responses, whether to cold exposure, infection, or combined crises, carried the imprint of this event. Not its mythology, but its lessons. Recognize patterns early, communicate clearly, adapt quickly. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. Contemporary public health doctrine emphasizes rapid information sharing across jurisdictions to prevent isolated incidents from remaining disconnected. And the myth? It persists because it is simple, because it explains the unexplainable in a way that feels complete. But the truth is less dramatic and more instructive. What happened in Alaska in 1995 was not the rise of the dead. It was the moment a fragile system was tested by environment and uncertainty and learned just in time how not to break.